They told her there were only two choices: $500,000 for a heart surgeon, or the slow, certain grief of watching the woman who had raised her, who smelled of lavender and lemon oil and old quilts, drown in time. Cerelia folded the paper until the edges softened, until the numbers blurred. She could hear Grandma's breath in the next room, a shallow, brittle thing that had once been loud enough to sing morning hymns over. That breath had been her compass. Without it, she had no map to follow. The train smelled of metal and coffee and rain. Outside the window, the countryside blurred into neat slices of corn and fence posts, the familiar geometry of home slipping away. Cerelia had learned to carry the village with her in small containers. A tin of the lavender they dried by the back door, a photograph of Grandma in a faded Sunday dress, a scarf with the frayed edge Grandma liked to tuck into a pocket when she worried. She kept those things close now because the city demanded more than currency. It demanded a hard skin and the forgetting of soft habits. Someone had to come through. That was all she had told herself for the 6 hours of the ride. That and the picture of the hospital bill she had carried against her chest like a talisman. $500,000. The number felt obscene on her tongue. Her father lived in that city. He had money, she thought, if only he would remember her. That was the logic she took with her, naive and stubborn as a seed root pressing into concrete. She had rehearsed how she would speak to him, how she would fold her disappointment and lay it on his table, how she would demand the dignity of a daughter, not a debtor. What she had not rehearsed, what no rehearsal could have prepared her for, was the sudden cold of a stranger's voice across the carriage and the way a presence can settle like a shadow in a room. He stepped into the compartment with a calm that felt like an order. The men with him moved like wind around him, synchronized and silent. He wore nothing outlandish, an immaculate coat, a dark shirt that caught the light like polished stone. But there was an anatomy to his movements, an unspoken law in the way people made way for him. The world tightened when Xavier Locke entered it. The air seemed to hold its breath. Cerelia looked at him and felt the old country sayings rise. Devil wears no horns. The nickname had followed him even into the papers. The Devil of Seaton, a tag that laughed in the face of sentiment. When one of his men glanced at the hospital bill, a line of understanding passed over his face. Xavier's eyes slid toward her, and, for a dizzy second, she forgot to be careful. There was nothing in his gaze that offered pity. There was a measurement, a tallying of a problem. She understood then that she was nothing but a variable. He spoke not to her at first, but to the carriage. "Is the woman well?" he asked. Nothing here was small. His voice made questions into verdicts. She found herself explaining, too much, too quickly, the brittle details. A surgeon with a waiting list, a hospital that would not take her word, a father who had been difficult to find. The words felt thin against his silence. Around them, other passengers pretended not to listen. Pride is a private injury. Theirs would not be witnessed by strangers. He listened with an economy of movement, then asked, "How much?" When she said it aloud, everything rearranged. $500,000, like an accusation. One of his men produced a business card and a number, the kind of number that made phone calls fall into other hands. Xavier folded the card between his fingers like an offering and, without softness, put a hand on the back of the seat that separated them. "We can fix that," he said. Relief was a brittle thing. It arrived like glass breaking, a sharp, clean sound. And before she could be wholly grateful, the train lurched and the carriage doors opened at a station. 2 women burst in, laughing, wrapped in coats that smelled of new money and polished perfume. Their eyes fell on Cerelia like knives. It would be one thing if they pitied her. It was another when they wore disgust as jewelry. "You can't travel like that and expect charity," one of them said, loud enough for everyone to hear. She had a voice that could unpick confidence at its seams. "This isn't a countryside fair. You should go back where you belong." The words landed as they always do, as though polite scorn was the currency by which the city maintained itself. Cerelia's hand tightened around the hospital bill until the paper creased. She had come to the city to ask for money. She had not come to be dismissed as a laugh. Pride flared stupidly. It always flared in the places that needed cooling. Xavier's hand tightened on his coat. He moved then, not because he was gentle, but because he saw an imbalance that might be inconvenient. He bought them off in the carriage, an old ugly show of dominance that the city understood. He paid their tab, whispered something that made their faces bloom into gratitude, and for a moment it looked as if the humiliation would pass. The women left with feathered laughter. The carriage exhaled, but the balance had already shifted. The moment of intervention made him an actor in her story. People who hold the strings do not give them up easily. When they disembarked at the city station, Xavier said, casual and rehearsed, "There will be someone to meet your grandmother at the hospital. Make arrangements with my people." Cerelia planned to refuse. Pride and strategy are not the same, but she kept them close as if they were the same coin. She opened her mouth to decline, to say no, to insist she would not be beholden. Before the sentence fully formed, one of his men produced a photograph. It wasn't of Xavier or of the city. It was a picture of a narrow bedroom, sun slanting across quilted fabric, a hand with the light pocked into it. The photograph had been taken in a way that made her stomach fall out from under her. It was Grandma. The photograph was of Grandma at the clinic, smiling through oxygen tubes in a way that shrank her into a single image of need. There was a note on the back, minimal, unfeeling. Meet them at St. Baird. They had already arranged a room for the old woman. That was a fact. The train station swallowed her protest. "How do you have that?" she demanded. Xavier's reply was not boastful, it was fact-bound. "We can make it happen faster than anyone else, but there are terms." Terms. The word had a small bourgeois sting to it, but when it was attached to a person with the means to bend hospitals, it felt like a guillotine. Cerelia's reaction was a shape of rage and vulnerability. "You do not bargain for your grandmother in the same tone you bargain for a lease." "I don't take charity," she said. He looked at her then for a long time, his face a carved thing of stone. There was nothing indulgent about the way he regarded her pride. "This is not charity," he said. "It is a transaction. You want her saved. I want something. If you won't accept help without strings, then accept help with precise strings." She had come to the city with the illusion that money could be a bridge. It had become a negotiation that offered no bridges. He spoke about legalities and registrations, and the ease with which the law could be bent if one had the will and the wallet. The bargain he proposed made Cerelia's skin crawl. "Sign your name to me publicly at the municipal registry, a marriage on paper, $500,000 wired to the hospital. He would guarantee the operation." The words sat like coal in her mouth. The proposal was not masked as kindness. It was titled, ledger-like. It would be humiliating to announce it. Her hands trembled, not with the cold of the station, but with the anatomy of the decision. If she signed, Grandma would live. If she refused, the next 50 years of memory might be composed of regret. She thought of recipes misremembered, of Grandma's voice calling her name across fields, of how the old woman had stitched coins into the hem of Cerelia's coats for emergencies. She thought of the nightlights and the small ordinances of care. She thought of the way a handful of pills could be worth the whole of a life. She had not planned for her adult years to be arithmetic, but here she was. The ledger was the city's greatest religion. "I will not be a thing you buy," she said finally, with a stubbornness so soft it might have been mistaken for fear. "You will sign," Xavier corrected. "You will go to the registry, you will marry me, I will cover the hospital costs and any aftercare. You will have your grandmother back. You will have money that keeps the house and the rest of your life in order. In return, you will give me what I ask." There were men in suits who could have arrested him for coercion, if anyone bothered to care. The city had its moral calculus. No one spoke for a while but Cerelia. Her decision was not made in the grandeur of a noble soul, but in a cramped corridor of survival. When she left the station, she walked as if she were walking underwater. People stepped aside for them, for Xavier and his entourage, and for the woman walking like she carried a stone inside her pocket. She tried to scold herself for choosing badly, for not punching him, for not asking the world for justice. Those pieces of anger were not luxuries she could afford. They required time and the trust that someone else might carry them for you. She had neither. Before the registry, meant to be the quick, administrative pen stroke that would alter the rest of their lives, Xavier did something that unsettled the public choreography. He went to the hospital first, walked into the room where Grandma lay under white sheets like a small island, and told the doctors to begin work. He signed private checks that made machines hum. He issued orders with the authority of someone who could make consequences appear like rain. Cerelia watched from the doorway as Grandma's hand twitched beneath the sheets. The nurse looked at her with a sympathy so clinical it was almost sterile. "We'll do everything," she said, as if everything could be measured. Cerelia felt herself unraveling at the seams and then patching, a fabric that had always been frayed, then mended. At the registry, the room was bureaucratic, the walls a pallid beige that chewed at dignity. There were no witnesses, she knew. There were signatures and the soft hospital lights and the stale air of municipal certainties. The official slid forms across the table like meat across a butcher block. Cerelia's name was written there in the harsh, careful penmanship of a clerk who had seen many lives reduced to signatures. She signed because the pen had weight and gravity, and because she wanted to shrink the possibility of the worst thing that could happen. The marriage certificate was a legal text. It was also, in that exact moment, a wound. She felt it as a hollow space inside her chest, a hole where trust used to sit. She wrote her name with a small domestic defiance, the handwriting of a girl who had always written letters on lined paper to be placed into envelopes for other people. Xavier watched her hand with an inscrutability that skimmed past cruelty into something more difficult to name. There was no theatrical clashing of swords, no forced belts and shackles. The marriage performed in cold ink satisfied the law. There would be no dramatic cathedral scene, just paper and an obligation. People who called themselves friends congratulated him later as if he had done some charitable thing. Their words turned on the air like moths. After the signatures, the legal formalities were met, and the hospital breathed another hour of certainty. Cerelia ran her fingers along the edge of the form as if she could find the seam that would let her pull herself free. But the seam was sealed. They left the registry under a thin lunchtime sun. A few cameras flashed, enough to make her face feel like a mask, and a gossip column would surely call it an unexpected alliance. The whites of people's eyes were hungry to judge. The city always had room for a spectacle. For the white family, for the socialites who had mocked her, the marriage was a feast. In the beginning, for Xavier, Cerelia was a convenient signature. For Cerelia, he was a man who had promised her grandmother's life in exchange for her name. The ledger had made them both into parties in a transaction. Everything else would depend on what happened in the hours and days after. He escorted her to his car with a solidity that suggested no alternative. It was not the car that signified anything, though it was long, black, and smelled faintly of leather. It was the procession, the hush that fell into the world after his passage. He gave orders that arranged the world, a room at a private clinic, a nurse who would not ask unnecessary questions, arrangements for aftercare and a bed, and a driver who would take them to the mansion if she so wished. On the drive, Cerelia watched the city slide past in glass and chrome. The buildings rose like columns of a different religion. The city was an altar for success. She let her mind wander somewhere else, back to the small green table by the kitchen window of her house, to the sound of Grandma's spoon against porcelain. When the car pulled into the wrought gate of Xavier's home, it was as if she had been ushered into a theater set for a play she had not auditioned for. The mansion was a study in precision. High ceilings, art that felt like a defiance of time. It was not ostentation for the sake of pleasure. It was ostentation to keep other things at bay. Servants moved with the practiced invisibility of people who had been taught to erase themselves. There was a geometry to the rooms, furniture placed as if to measure all comers. He led her to a room that had been prepared with a kind of careful efficiency. It smelled faintly of citrus and clean linen. He left an envelope on the bedside table. Inside, there were funds, enough for immediate needs, and keys for the house she must maintain for her grandmother's recovery. The gesture was not tenderness, it was administration. It was a hand that knew how to fix logistics and be done with sentiment. That evening, when the doctors called to say the surgery had been successful, when the machine over Grandma's bed hummed with a borrowed promise, Cerelia cried for a long time in a bathroom that wasn't hers. The tears had nothing to do with happiness. They were the relief of a tightness snapping, followed by the ache of a new geometry in which she found herself located. She decided then that survival could be its own moral geography. Hurting for it did not make one corrupted. Word travels fast in the city. That first night, in the quiet corner of his study, Xavier watched her alone. It was a private thing, glancing at the woman he had bought into being his. He wanted to measure her. There was something in the way she slept, stoic even in relief, that made him think of his own absence of ease, that made a hollow feel like a domestic thing he recognized. He had been raised with doors shut for reasons he could not name as a child. In a house that put on a face for public life, affection had been a private contraband. He had learned to purchase things the way others collected hobbies. Power had been the substitute for a lapse of tender language he had never heard. When he saw a woman who had given away her name to keep someone else alive, an old calculus shifted. She had made a trade. He had bought the results. He had not imagined that the purchase would be complicated by the presence of care. For Cerelia, the mansion felt like a gilded prison. She refused a woman at a midnight feast who offered ribbons and the affront of small talk. She refused gifts, at least at first. There were rules of etiquette that felt like mockery. The White family sent a wreath of perfumes for courtesy. She could not tell whether it was pity or celebration. The people in silk seemed to think her name was a toy placed on the mantel, and to be admired as one admires oddities. She kept the curtain of her distance as if it could be a shield. She spent afternoons on the phone with the hospital, with the village, with Jarvis and Alicia, who had called to say they were coming once the surgery was done. They sounded like anchors, their voices seasoned with small domestic jokes and the kind of loyalty that dirt cultivates. "Don't sign anything else without us," Alicia told her. But Cerelia could see the arithmetic of life. Sometimes you sign away a piece of yourself to keep another piece breathing. Zman came to the city shortly after, carrying with him the perfume of promises half-kept. He had been her youth's betrothed, in the way that small towns sometimes write vows into notebook margins. He was handsome in the obliging, reckless way of men who grow up believing that charm is security. He had promised once to leave the village and take care of her and Grandma. When the city made its judgment, he had chosen to cultivate ties in other quarters. Ties that glittered, and paid less attention to people who smelled of lavender. Zman offered money at first, with the kind of theatricality small towns mistake for sincerity. "I can fix this," he said at dinner, eyes bright with the kind of arrogance that assumes things will always go his way. He offered half the amount, or so he said, with a smile that was meant to be reassuring. Cerelia watched him, and felt the threads of disappointment tighten. "You were never gone," he said, meaning that his affections had been constant. He used words like anchors and homecoming, but his hand avoided the ledger she now navigated. When she needed him to be concrete, to act in the way of men who keep their promises, he became a series of slippery excuses. Calls that ended abruptly, an account that had insufficient funds, a phone turned off at critical hours. Cerelia learned to see him as an emblem of small-town habit. Promises given like candy, and not thought through. The city seemed to whisper that men like Xavier could buy anything, including apologies. Men like Zman could do nothing but remind others of what they had lost. The White family, their mouths a line of pale pearls, watched every exchange as if it were a court case. They had made a spectacle of her at the registry, and continued to humiliate her through the invisible rituals of the elite. Invitations she was not meant to belong to, scrawny remarks about rustic charm and backward sensibilities. They were determined to keep the world arranged to their liking. Cerelia stood her ground in small ways. She refused to move in with a staff of women who would speak only in code. She cooked once for her grandmother in a borrowed kitchen and felt the magic of domestic competence return slowly. She folded sheets. She bought a pot of basil and kept it on a windowsill where the light was kinder. Dignity, she learned, was a habit as much as a state of being. It kept you warm like a blanket, and it told stories about who you were beneath the business of other people's opinions. Xavier noticed those things. He watched how she aligned her hands in the way of someone who grew up making a bed for someone else every morning as an act of worship. He began to give orders with a different tone, less because he was trying to possess her, and more because something in him was learning how to create safety. He arranged for the best cardiac team, and, when social gossip tried to paint him as the architect of a cold bargain, he countered the narrative with small acts of protection for the woman who had signed his name. But protection from Xavier came with a shadow. The first time he stepped between Cerelia and a man from the White family who made a comment about her origins, there was a dangerous line in his body that she recognized from the tabloids. It was a reminder that the system that had brought her this life was capable of violence. He told the man, politely but with a gravity that foreclosed argument, to be more courteous. The man blanched and left like someone who had been warned by a storm. Cerelia watched the exchange with a complicated gratitude. To be defended was to know that someone was keeping a place at table for you, but to be defended by a man who wielded fear like a tool made her uneasy. She had not asked for that sort of guardianship. She had merely asked for a surgeon's scalpel and for a chance at the rest of her life. There were rumors then, the kind the city produces quickly, that Xavier had rescued her from penniless fate, that he had brought a village maid into the lion's den and made her his. The gossip ruined his privacy as rapidly as it inflated his legend. Yet inside the mansion, away from the journalists and the tasting menus where the city measures itself, something quieter started to form. It was not yet love. Watching two people conflate habit and care into surrender was too simple a narrative, but there were fractures and seams of a relationship that could be mended. Xavier began to bring her small things. A covered bowl of soup left at her door, an extra blanket in the sitting room. At first, she refused to accept them. Later, she would hide at the kitchen doorway and watch how his hand lingered over the teacup he carried for her, how his eyes softened over the smallest domestic tasks. When he argued at the hospital for greater attention to Grandma's aftercare, his voice dropped into a private frequency that, even so, made sense to the staff. "Do everything necessary," he said in that voice. "No shortcuts. Complications are not an option. I want her safe." Those words were administration, yes, but they were also the first time he used the language of care for something that wasn't his. He had protected territory and profit for so long that the use of that force to shield a fragile life felt close to sacrilege. The city had taught him to protect investments. He was learning to protect a life. There were moments when the past arrived like a cough. In the quiet hours, he would walk the house and stop by a window and touch the glass as if calming a fight. One night, Cerelia overheard him speak on the phone to someone she could not see. He said her name without the ledger's reserve, only in the occasional softness people say for rooms where no one else lives. She began to suspect there were parts of him that had been unmoored for reasons bigger than themselves. The village called often. Jarvis and Alicia sent small parcels, knitted hats for Grandma, dried pears, and letters packed with gossip and with loyalty. They told her about Benita's latest charity luncheon and about a neighbor who had begun to plant a new row of beans for the coming season. The village was a map of ordinary things that kept her tethered to a life of honest toil and slow forgiveness. It felt necessary because it offered a perspective that the mansion did not, a life that was judged by the goodness of bread baking rather than the price of a bracelet. Then quietly, a revelation from the past began to make itself visible in the patterns of the present. Cerelia had always had a memory, a childlike, luminous recollection, of a stranger who had once saved her from a dangerous fall behind the orchard when she was 5. In that memory, a boy had pressed her to safety and left a mark beside his heart. A small birthmark like a plum blossom. For years she had told the story as if it were a talisman that reminded her people arrive when they must. She had pointed at a shallow curve in her memory and said, "He had a plum blossom there." The years had mossed over the detail like neglect. In the last few months, in certain quiet lights, she noticed a hint of a mark beneath Xavier's collar when he bent to speak to her about arrangements or when he brushed hair from his own forehead in a private kitchen. Once, when a scarf slipped, she saw something faint, no larger than a finger, and it made a tiny bell ring inside her skull. Had memory been a soft instrument, then the bell would have been loud enough to startle her. She did not tell him the thought immediately. The idea that he might be the boy who had once saved her felt too large to be true. She had 1,000 reasons to doubt her own memory. People do not reconnect with saviors like the plots of books. Memory is unreliable. Men are complicated. Yet there was an ache when she thought of that boy, of a small hand under the sky, and she could not help but wonder if fate had a cruelty in store or a kindness. The question sat between them like an unlit candle. If he was the boy, what would that mean? Would it disentangle the bargain they had made? Would it complicate the ledger into something human? Or would it be a trick of the heart that city lights magnified until the past looked like an apologetic narrative? There were other tensions, threads of the old world that refused neat closure. Xavier's family watched from the periphery. Frank, his brother, existed in the margins as a weathered thing, a man whose eyes held maps of anger. Frank's life had been tied to Xavier's by blood and resentment. He had never forgiven the ease with which the family put power on a pedestal and abandoned tenderness. Frank did not understand Cerelia. Men like him see women who come from nothing as threats to a family's carefully curated image. Rumors circulated as they do, as if truth were a fabric woven from gossip. Frank favored public displays of contempt, sending sharp letters and making thinly veiled remarks at gatherings. His tone toward Cerelia was colder than ice in a glass. He saw in her a blemish on the lock name, and he intended to remove the stain with the blunt instrument of family dignity. The city, which had negotiated this first bargain, was not done with its lessons. The White family began to press small attacks, insults at charity tables, whispers at the opera, invitations withheld and then used as weapons. They had manufactured a narrative around Cerelia that fit their appetite, that she was an opportunist, a village opportunist who had played the system. They did not know, or perhaps they did not care, that she had signed away a name in a desperate attempt to protect a life. When trouble came, it did not arrive as a shaking of the earth, but as a steady drip that wore away at the edge of things. A social invitation rescinded, a doctor questioned a privileged request, Frank's barbs murmured under the surface. Each incident was small, but the pattern sewed its seam into the fabric. Cerelia held herself together with a stubbornness that felt like grace. She set rules for herself. Never accept the first offer of help without considering the cost. Keep Grandma's dignity like a banner. Do not allow the mansion's opulence to define her worth. She found that discipline in a new life was the same as the discipline of a field. You tended, you waited, and you accepted that storms would come. Then there was the night in the garden when the city felt like a different planet. Xavier had walked her outside, where the air smelled of a rain that had fallen just before they emerged. There were lights around the terrace like distant stars pinned down. He stood near the low wall, watching the city, and for a while they were silent, as if silence could be a conversation. "It must be strange," he said at last, "to live in a place where every kindness has a price." "It is not that strange," she replied. "You get what you pay for either way, charity or coin. Both can be hard to swallow." He turned toward her then, and the expression in his face was not calculation. It was a fragile thing she hadn't expected to see. "I do not like that you had to choose," he said. "I do not like the ledger either." "Then why make me sign?" she asked. He looked away, and in the movement she read lines that had nothing to do with her. He had reasons, old hurts, new strategies, an instinct for control that was also his refuge. "Because I didn't think you could be trusted to accept help without being angry about it later. Because I thought it would be easier for you if it was something we both defined." Cerelia wanted to be outraged. Instead, she felt a complicated empathy for a man who had trained himself to see the world as a series of transactions because it was safer than the alternative, exposure to feeling. He had invented armor to survive. It made him formidable. It made him lonely. They were not so far from each other then. But to move from shared proximity to something like trust would require Cerelia to make choices on the terms she set. She had come to the city to save a life. She did not intend to lose her own in the process. In the days that followed the marriage, life settled into a rhythm that was both starker and softer than she expected. She visited Grandma at the hospital and found that the little rituals she performed, smoothing a blanket, reading a page from a book, made the world more legible for the old woman. Each small act became a defiant note against the city's loudness. Xavier maintained a presence like a weather pattern. He would appear in the middle of a visit and stand in the doorway, offering a terse update to the doctors that its staff could neither ignore nor resent. He would later leave anonymous gifts on the villa's porch, and then, later still, ask with a voice that was not as blunt as his public facade, "Is she comfortable? Does she need anything else?" Even as these moments occurred, the ledger was not erased. The marriage certificate sat in the study, a legal text that had done its work. The city had scheduled its judgments. The White family was preparing a social rebuke under the guise of a charity ball that would exclude Cerelia explicitly, and then mock her inclusion as a charity case once she was inevitably invited. One night, she dreamed of a plum blossom. It was a small mark of memory that felt like a secret letter. In the dream, a 5-year-old version of herself fell, and a boy reached out with a hand that smelled faintly of dust and figs. She woke with the taste of that hand in her mouth and the faint suspicion that her life, wound up in ink and hustle, might have more threads than anyone had thought. The story paused there, balanced on that cusp of possibility. Cerelia was in a new world she had agreed to enter for the sake of another. Xavier, a man shaped by the hard lessons of power, was learning what it might mean to protect rather than possess. The ledger had been opened. The book would not be closed easily. Outside, the city hummed with judgment, with gossip, with the taste of money that never quieted. Inside, in quiet rooms and at the foot of a hospital bed, minute decisions were being made about food, about how to speak of the past, about how to be safe. The marriage had saved a life. That fact stood like a lighthouse in a storm, but it had also begun something fragile and dangerous, a slow, precarious motion towards something that might, if they both chose it, be love. Neither had promised that yet. Neither had the right to. The rest of the story would demand courage of a more complicated kind than the courage to sign a name on a dotted line. It would demand that Cerelia reclaim agency on terms that felt true, and that Xavier learn the language of choosing rather than taking. For now, the city slept under its bright, indifferent lights. Inside the mansion, a woman wrapped in a borrowed shawl sat by the window, holding a small photograph of her grandmother, and wondered at the cost and the shape of what she had done. Across the hall, a man who had never taught himself to ask for mercy sat with his own private ledger, and after a long time, he closed it and pressed his fingers to the small, faint scar near his collarbone, the shape of a plum blossom he'd forgotten he had. The scar under his collarbone was small, no larger than a thumbprint, a faded plum blossom of pale tissue and faint pigment. Xavier had always kept it covered, collars straight, shirts buttoned high, but at odd moments, when he bent to point something out on a document, or when the light fell through the kitchen window just so, a sliver of that pale mark would flash like an unspoken punctuation. Cerelia had noticed it in the days after the registry, half convinced that the memory was a child's trick. How imagination threads itself onto reality until you can no longer tell which thread is real. Now, alone at the window with the photograph of her grandmother clutched like a promise, that memory rose again like tidewater. The plum blossom in her recollection was a small thing, a mark on the chest of the boy who had pulled her back from a broken fence and a fall when she was 5. He smelled of dust and figs, or perhaps that was the memory making details where it could. He had put his own jacket over her, had murmured something about being careful, and then he had gone away without fanfare, almost like a secret rescue that asked nothing in return. Across the hall, Xavier closed his hands over that same little scar and thought of the orchard behind his grandfather's house where he'd hidden because he didn't fit the mold his family expected. He had been small then, not yet the man the papers called the devil. He had been a boy who loved to climb trees and who kept a pocket knife for whittling. He'd been clever enough to open gates for a thrill and clumsy enough to trip over his own shoelaces. He had memory, too, of a small girl crying, a soft voice that said thank you, of a pair of small sticky hands that had tried to tug his sleeve and then let go. He had not told anyone about that day. To admit it would have been to admit softness in a life built on arrangements and iron. He had left because leaving was the only plausible explanation in a family where softness was punished. He had been too young to understand that some good things were not transactions you could trade away for survival. He had left, and the guilt had nested in him like a splinter. The memory unspooled between them as if time had a seam, and they were each tugging at opposite edges. Cerelia felt the tug at the edge of her awareness, an ache that might be real or imagined. She could have let it remain a private question, the kind that murmurs through people's lives and never demands answers. Instead, in a moment that felt more brave than prudent, she carried the photograph into the hallway and knocked gently on the study door. He looked up from the paper, and, for the first time since their signatures had made them legally bound, she saw him unprepared for a question about who he had been before his name meant something to the world. She set the photograph on the desk and pointed, not to the hospital image, but to a folded part where the negative space made a small shadow. "When you were a boy," she said, voice low, "did you ever—" She stopped because the words felt fragile. "Did you ever climb the orchard fence by the stream?" Xavier's hand paused over the ink. For the second time in as many days, something private slid loose. He could have lied. He had lied many times. Strategies, half-truths, maneuvers that kept him ahead. He could have said nothing, the easier thing, and let her keep piecing a past that might not be hers to claim. Instead, a thin thing, regret, maybe, made him small. "Yes," he said. "When I was 8. The single syllable shifted the air. Cerelia took a breath and walked closer. "Did you?" she began again, and then steadier. "Did you have a small mark by your heart, like a plum blossom? I remember." His fingers tightened, as if feeling the exact place she named. He didn't answer at once. In silence, the study became a room where two people measured the distance between what had been purchased and what had been remembered. Outside, a car rolled past. Inside, nothing else made sound. When he spoke, his voice had the flatness of someone showing what they had learned to hide. "I have a small mark," he said. "I never thought it would matter to anyone." For a long second, she watched the man she had signed an inked contract with as if learning to read him anew. He was less myth and more scarred fact. A man who'd been built from neglect, who had learned to make power a shelter. The plum blossom wasn't proof enough in itself. Memory is a brittle thing. But recognition didn't sit only on skin. It sat in the way he shifted his weight, like the boy who had sprinted to catch a falling kite, and in the softness he briefly allowed when he thought himself alone. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, and the question was not accusation as much as a child's confusion voiced with adult stakes. "Because I thought it would complicate things," he said. "Because when a thing is given power over you, it's easier to keep it as an asset rather than a weakness. I thought leaving that mark unspoken was the cost of keeping my hands clean." "Hands clean?" She laughed softly, an edge of incredulity in it. "You bought my grandmother's operation with my life." He looked at her then, and something like shame crossed his expression, brief, genuine. "I bought it with your name because I couldn't imagine you would accept help without being angry later. It seemed less humiliating to make it a ledger than to offer a hand and expect gratitude." She could have let the conversation end there. Many women had. Many women signed away parts of the self so that the rest could breathe. But Cerelia had never been satisfied with bargains that left her brittle. Beneath the anger and the membership of that bargain lived an uneasy gratitude toward a man who had used his power to shield her grandmother. And, if memory had any truth, a boy who had once stopped a fall. "Prove it," she said simply. "Tell me about the fence. Tell me what you were wearing. Tell me if you had a pocket knife." He blinked. The request was oddly specific, and for a man who controlled much, being reduced to such small details was humbling. "I had a blue jacket," he said after a while. "It was too big and smelled like engine oil. I had a pocket knife with a wooden handle. I fell twice. I helped you up because I was afraid you'd break something precious." A laugh escaped her, half joy, half sorrow. The sound broke a little of the cold circumference that had surrounded them since the registry. Proof was an odd thing. It didn't have to be more than a few honest details to become a bridge. She studied his face like reading a map. "If that boy saved me," she said, "why did he go?" He closed his eyes then, and the answer dropped out like a stone. "Because I didn't know how to ask to stay," he said. "Fear did what fear always does. It told me to run before anyone could call me soft. I thought I was protecting myself. I was protecting a version of me that had been trained not to need anyone." The words had a brittle honesty that made her heart ache in its original place. People are complicated in practice. He had been both her captor and her savior at different times. The ledger had been opened with a ruthless clarity. What came after would not be resolved by names or scars alone. That night, as she lay awake in a room that had once been designed for guests and now felt like a neutral territory between transactions, she considered the line between agency and coercion. She had signed because she would rather give her name than lose her grandmother. That decision still sat heavy on her like a wet coat. Yet memory and the small domestic kindnesses Xavier offered, soup left at her door, the care he insisted upon at the hospital, had eroded something fundamental in her initial impression, that he was simply possession incarnate. He was telling her, in his stilted confessions, that he had not only purchased an operation, he had also been shaped by a world that left him brittle. That was no exoneration for how he had made her choose. It was, however, a beginning, a truer beginning than either of them expected. A new storm formed in miniature when Zaman reappeared with a full smile and the rustle of opportunistic charm. The man who had once promised to take her away from the village now stood on Xavier's marble terrace as if the city were his natural hunting ground. He was more handsome than competent, and his eyes had learned to tilt with calculation. "You look well," Zaman said to Cerelia, offering a hand that hovered and then withdrew when Xavier's presence tightened the air. "Zaman," she said, keeping civility like a coat buttoned at the neck, "I'm surprised to see you back in town so soon." He laughed, an easy sound meant to smooth. "I heard the news. I thought I might help. You know me. I never left you completely." There was a theatricality to his performance, and Cerelia had learned to read performative gestures. He was the sort of man who loved to be needed, but who flinched at responsibility. Xavier watched the exchange with a patience that had an undercurrent of assessment. He had come to understand, in his own way, that the city's predators wore different faces. Some prey used violence, others used charm and the appearance of reliability long enough to profit. Zaman in the sunlight offered a check, one that looked generous at first glance. He said he had business partners, second mortgages, something faintly credible beneath it all. Cerelia, polite and tired, accepted the paper for a moment and then examined it later in her room, where the bed's edges felt like borders to be respected. The check was a fiction, either forged or intentionally insufficient, and the numbers smudged when she tried to confirm the bank's details. When she confronted him in a backyard planted with a few potted herbs, his charm collapsed like a stage prop. "I told you I'd help," he said, voice lower now. "Maybe I can't give the full amount. Maybe I thought someone else would step in." "Someone else did," Cerelia said. "Someone paid." His eyes narrowed, not in guilt, but in calculation. "You were always dramatic," he said, signing his name, making it all official. "You could have had me instead, you know. No papers, just us." The idea disgusted her in an old familiar way, the way it always had when Zaman suggested shortcuts. "This wasn't about you," she said coldly. "This was about my grandmother." Humiliation, the city had taught her, is a currency men like Zaman spend when they find themselves outside a single narrative. He tried to turn the conversation into a private negotiation, but Cerelia refused. She had learned, under the press of hospital lights and the coldness of registries, not to be persuaded back into a moment that would cost someone else a life. It was not only Zaman who threatened to destabilize her new fragile balance. The White family had cultivated a campaign of quiet smears, but now they worked with more direct cruelty. Bonita White, with the icy smile and the club of social influence, had begun to orchestrate a plan to publicly assert their power. They had husbands with legal brains and friends at the paper. They also had a network of complaint and entitlement that could hammer at reputations. Digging deeper, Cerelia discovered payments and whispered conversations that suggested Zaman had been on the White family's payroll as a kind of pawn, a man who offered charm in exchange for favors and small betrayals. He had not been the gallant protector of their youth. He had been a man who lent his name to schemes that made him feel bigger. The discovery hurt not only because he had lied, but because his betrayal was so ordinary, so small town in its cruelty. He had chosen safety, the city's safety, over fidelity. Confrontation followed in the way that truths often do, merciless and necessarily public. At a charity fundraiser arranged by Bonita to humiliate Cerelia under the guise of inclusion, Zaman tried to stage an encounter where he would present himself as the humble benefactor, only to be undone by evidence Xavier's people produced. Simon, Xavier's lieutenant, had quietly gathered bank statements and a follow-the-money paper trail that pointed to Zaman's role in a slush fund. The reveal was painful for Zaman. A man who longed to be seen as generous now stood exposed as a conduit for the White family's cruelty. When asked to defend himself, Zaman faltered. His excuses were small and obvious. The charity event, meant to be a public humiliation of Cerelia, backfired spectacularly. Bonita's smile soured as gossip turned to outrage. The White family's attempt to orchestrate a scandal was outmaneuvered. Cameras that had arrived to catch the village girl's disgrace instead framed Zaman as the opportunist he had always been. The press loved reversal. So did the public. Humiliation returned to its rightful owner, Bonita and her associates. The parish of public opinion is a fickle thing. Those who arrange spectacles often find themselves burnt by them. Zaman's reputation withered. Invitations he had assumed were his vanished. He retreated like someone who had been left behind at a station, unaware that his ticket had been cancelled. For Cerelia, the moment was bittersweet. She had wanted Zaman to be true, if only because longings do not always allow for practical measures. But truth is its own currency. She had signed a paper to save her grandmother. She had not signed off on being conned into believing a child's promise could become an adult's foundation. The fragility of the mansion's equilibrium was shattered a few days later in an incident that would force every pretense to the surface. Frank Locke, Xavier's brother, had always been a bruise in the family. He was blunt and resentful, and had long resented the attention paid to the elder brother who had carved his own kingdom out of opportunism. Frank's resentment now found a target in Cerelia, both because she represented an affront to family image and because he had privately feared that any softness toward her was a weakness that might be leveraged against him. He planned an ambush, not with the cinematic brutality of a crime novel, but with a method his kind understood: leverage and fear. He would take a photograph of Cerelia leaving the hospital where her grandmother convalesced and stage a scandal to force Xavier's hand. The plot required small misdirections: a thug in the garden, an overheard conversation made to sound obscene, a well-timed phone call to a journalist. Frank's plan was to humiliate rather than harm, to make sure the family regained its control by showing it could rouse public shame and thus coerce Xavier back into the fold. It went wrong in a way Frank had not anticipated. The thug he hired to create fear was less skilled than expected. In the scramble, the violence became real. A scuffle by the hospital door, a pushed shoulder, a twisted ankle. Xavier's presence at the hospital, which had been frequent and sometimes grudging, now turned decisive. He arrived to find his wife, legalities still brittle though they were, shielded by a handful of men who had intended to cause spectacle. When the scuffle escalated and the thug pulled a knife, things turned sharp and unscripted. Xavier moved like a weather event, quick and brutal, not because the devil loves blood, but because he had the reflexes a man of his life developed to survive. He stepped between Cerelia and the threat, and the blade found his forearm. It was not a cinematic wound, there was no spray of gore, but the cut was enough to force blood to the surface, enough to turn the air cold. They retreated into the hospital with sirens coming somewhere far off, an ordinary world reasserting its care. The doctor who stitched Xavier's forearm was professional and unsentimental. "You should not have done that," the physician said, more quietly than clinically. "You could have been seriously hurt." Xavier's answer was the kind of honesty that had cost him more than one public smile. "She can't be humiliated," he said simply. "Not by a brother, not by a paper, not by a small man with a big mouth." After that night, his body looked different in a way that made Cerelia feel both afraid and oddly tender. A thread of vulnerability ran through him now that wasn't just confession. It had been paid for with blood. The incident sparked an investigation that turned Frank's covert campaign into overt criminal charges. The hired thug's fingerprints connected to a small ring of men who had been doing odd jobs for Frank. When questioned, he named the source. Evidence is a practical thing. It either clears people or binds them. Frank had wanted to bind Xavier to his family code. Instead, the law found reason to look at him. He was arrested quietly in his flat. A paper-bagged bottle of whiskey and a string of recordings he had made in a fit of bravado. Evidence that he had planned the ambush not merely for family pride, but to shore up his own dominance in the family power play. Xavier's influence could have smoothed the matter, tucked it into a drawer, and let family shame do its work. Instead, perhaps for the first time, he did not turn family loyalty into cover for wrongdoing. He allowed the police to do their work. The media framed his choice as ambiguous. The devil letting his own brother be held accountable. Some called it a moral turn, others called it convenience. Both were true in parts. The legal machinery moved slowly but inexorably. Frank was charged with solicitation of assault and a string of other misdemeanors. The White family, watching from the bleachers of their social power, found their own attempts at manipulation undercut by legal scrutiny. The city, which loved spectacle, found in the trial a fresh menu. In the end, Frank's arrest was not a clean moral sweep. Family fault lines remained. But consequences were being paid. That mattered. The next assault on their fragile stability came from the water, a chase that began on a moonlit rooftop and ended with a narrow escape in a small motorboat. It was an absurd, almost cinematic sequence. Steps on tiled roofs, a cityscape that glittered in townhouse windows, the thunder of jesters and engines, the sudden shriek of tires as pursuers tried to close a circle. The chase had been arranged by those who still believed the old city rules: menace, spectacle, and making fear practical enough to wash over someone. Cerelia had gone to the roof that night because she couldn't stay inside and breathe the mansion's heavy air. The city at night looks like a folded map of lights. From the terrace, she could imagine home as a small pinprick far away. She had not expected danger. She had expected only the kind of silence that lets you hear your own heart. When the first shadow fell across her path, she understood how fragile the safety Xavier could offer was. A pair of men came at her with rope and with the intention to drag her from the house and into a car that smelled of wet leather. It was crude and designed for fear, less deadly, more humiliating. She fought because women like her did not have the luxury of resignation. She screamed, and the noise that follows a scream is something that can make a city turn its face. Xavier appeared then, and the rooftop turned from a simple place of air into a battleground of speed and decision. He moved like a man who had rehearsed saving a person many times in his head. Precise, cold, effective. One of the men pushed them both toward the parapet, and for a fraction of a breath, the world narrowed to a ledge and to the cold slap of stone against skin. Xavier shoved one assailant backward, the other swung, and Xavier took the blow meant for Cerelia across his shoulder. They both staggered to a lower terrace. Cerelia lost her balance and at the edge, found only a quick-minded fear that turned into action. She grabbed a drainpipe, she slid, she fell a small distance and found herself landing in a clump of ivy with a crack that made all the adrenaline spill into white-hot pain. They escaped to a small dock by the river where a waiting boat rocked with the night's breath. The men at the dock were not the city's best sailors. They were men used to following orders and not to improvising in the light of trouble. Xavier pushed them into the water with something like contempt, and then drove the motorboat away with hands that steadied as if handling a steering wheel were as natural as the ledger's pen. It was on that water, surrounded by darkness and with the city skyline cutting a serrated edge against the moon, that Xavier realized his own limits. He realized that his power did not make him invulnerable. He found that cage of control could be breached when someone he cared for was threatened. At the hospital, now bandaged and exhausted, Xavier's stoicism cracked in a way that demanded witness. The doctors had sewn his shoulder, but the wound beneath, the one that bled old habits and new fears, was deeper. He did not show off the stitches. He had no appetite for the city's narrative. He wanted the small things. A cup of hot tea given into his hand by someone who knew how to do it without asking for anything in return. Cerelia, for all her anger at being bought, found herself sitting by his bed in a kind of exhausted truce. Their hands met over the armrest, and for the first time since the registry, she felt entitled to touch his skin without the weight of paper between them. It was not cardinals and trumpets. It was two people exhausted and quiet at the center of a storm. The hospital called 2 nights later with news that made everything else seem simultaneously small and urgent. Grandma had suffered a complication from post-operative infection, an occurrence the doctors had feared but not expected. Her oxygen levels dipped. She needed intensive attention. The room where she had been convalescing smelled of antiseptic and worry. Machines blinked. Caregivers moved with deliberate furtiveness. They could not promise miracles, but they could promise to try everything. Xavier moved with a decisiveness that had nothing to do with his threat-making and everything to do with narrow, necessary compassion. He insisted on the best antibiotic, the closest monitoring, a specialist flown in from a better-equipped center. He argued with hotel managers about emergency beds. He called surgeons and did not accept bureaucracy as an answer. The ledger had taught him certain efficiencies. Now he used those efficiencies as a tool to try to keep a life steady. At one point, as doctors worked, a sudden issue with anaphylaxis threatened, an allergic reaction to a medication that would require quick antidote, and, for a brief terrifying instance, blood transfusion protocols that had to be executed precisely. The staff scrambled. Cerelia watched and felt the world narrow. She had gambled a name to save this life. Now the life itself seemed to hang by the precision of strangers' hands and the competence of the hospital. In the hallway, where light refracted in sterile angles, she found Xavier leaning against a wall, his hand to his face, his expression raw. She had expected more composed stewardship. Instead, he looked like someone in shock. Not from blood or pain, but from the vulnerability of facing that life might be too slender to catch. He turned to her then, and the words he used were almost too small. "I am not good with helplessness," he said. "You saved her by signing, and I thought buying it would make me a better man. But it is not buying that matters. It's what you do when the purchase isn't enough." Cerelia had a resistance that was patient and stubborn. She could, if she wanted, recede into a narrative where she owed him nothing. But watching him now, an apparatus of power rendered tender and useless by the same fragile human realities she had always known, she felt the lines between ownership and care blur. Later, after the crisis had passed, and Grandma's fever broke into a fragile remission, there was one scene that would steal the rest of their choices. Xavier, still in an arm sling, and on a level of exhaustion that made his jaw set hard, sat in the hospital chapel, a place he had never before entered for anything but photographs to manage an image. The chapel was small and smelled faintly of wax and old hymnals. He looked more like himself there than he had in any social program, honest in his smallness. He took her hand without ceremony and said, "I didn't think I'd ever ask for anything like forgiveness. I thought I could be enough by keeping people safe. But safety isn't the same as being wanted. If I ask you to stay, it won't be because you are a thing I've bought. It will be because of what you are to me when you are beside me. Could you consider staying because you choose to, not because ink forced you?" The question was a compass. It demanded an answer that belonged to her, not to law nor to ledger. She could have walked away then, chest tight and head high, and she would have been unashamed. She had given up pieces before to keep another's breath steady. She could do it again if duty told her so. But the face he offered afterward, raw, not heroic, became the ground she needed to stand on. She thought of Grandma's laugh as it returned in hospital corridors. She thought of the pot of basil on the mansion windowsill and the way the staff had simmered soup for her granny on slow days. She thought of the plum blossom scar, and the boy who had once been small enough to ask nothing at all. "I won't sign anything to make it legal again," she said slowly, "but I will stay. If I stay, it is because I choose it now, not because the paper told me to." His relief was almost audible, a small exhale that made him seem less like a fortress and more like a man. He closed his fingers over hers, and, in doing so, gave up a posture of command long enough to be human. From that soft place, the world shifted. The public wedding they had been slated to avoid for legal reasons, because the registry had already done what a ceremony would pretend to do, was reclaimed. What had begun as a humiliating transaction turned into a deliberate ceremony, one not of bought insurance, but of chosen companionship. It would be public, yes, but not as a spectacle of possession. It would be an announcement that two people, both bearing scars and difficult histories, had chosen each other with eyes open. The White family tried one last maneuver, a final attempt to gamble on spectacle. They sent a letter calling for the event to be cancelled, claiming impropriety and scandal, and the right to moral guardianship over the city's social fabric. But the city had shifted. The charity event's backfire had become a turning tide. Press outlets that had once delighted in humiliation now smelled hypocrisy. People, quietly hungry for stories where those who tried to crush others lost their footing, found the White family's campaign tiresome. The ceremony itself was modest and public. It was held in the old parish where Cerelia had once attended Sunday school as a child, an act of returning that suited her better than any gilded ballroom. The pews were a mixture, village friends who had come to see one of their own rise and reclaim dignity, members of the city's press who smelled a story, and a scattering of Xavier's world who observed with the same economy with which they conducted their lives. When Cerelia walked down the aisle, she did so with the same quiet dignity with which she had always moved through the world. Her gown was neither ostentatious nor humble. It was appropriate, chosen with the care one gives to small things. She was not the passive prize of the city. She was a woman who had made a painful choice and then, having been betrayed by the mechanism that forced that choice, had reclaimed agency. Xavier waited at the front with a simple ring in his hand, eyes steadier than they had been when he signed legal documents. When he spoke his vows, he did not recite contracts. He spoke instead of choices, and of mistakes that had to be atoned for, not with money but with sustained respect and willingness to change. "I have been given power my whole life," he said, voice steady. "I used it as a shield because I did not know how to ask to be loved. I asked you to sign as a way to avoid giving you what you deserved, an honest choice. I am sorry. I choose you now, not to own, but to be with, to learn, to build, to be chosen." Her answer came not as a surrender but as a promise. She spoke of duty and of love that grows in the soil of shared care. When she said the words aloud, "I choose you," it was a line of electricity that rewired the ledger from the inside. Outside the church, the village friends who had come to vindicate one of their own cheered when the couple emerged. They had held bonfires and meetings in the weeks prior to the ceremony, demanding that the city acknowledge that a woman should never be bought into silence. Jarvis and Alicia laughed with relief. Old neighbors who had once assumed Cerelia's fate was a tragedy now wept in the sunlight because there was a different ending. The White family, forced to see their campaign fail publicly, retreated like predators whose prey had changed. Their invitations dried up, and their influence, while not destroyed, lost some of its shine. Benita's smile turned brittle. It would not be a complete social exile. The city is too practical for complete moral victories. But there were consequences. Invitations withheld, trustees skeptical, partners calling for distance. Reputation costs money in a world defined by polished surfaces, and Benita found herself paying some of it. Frank's legal proceedings continued, and he was convicted on several counts related to coercion and solicitation. The sentence was not melodramatic. It was practical and punitive. He was fined, given community service, and placed under a restraining order that kept him away from family properties. The family had to reckon with its own dynamics. It was not a clean reconciliation. But the law had done what it could. It had named wrongdoing and meted out an attempt at redress. Zman, left with his reputation in tatters, returned to the village. There was no fanfare. He knocked on doors with a humility that had not been part of his wardrobe before. Cerelia watched him from a distance and felt neither triumph nor mercy. Some betrayals do not require revenge. They require quiet endings. Grandmother's recovery, too, was gradual and realistic. The hospital did not proclaim miracles. There were rounds of physiotherapy, medication adjustments, and days of dull, patient work. But her breathing grew steadier, and finally the color returned to her cheeks. She walked with a cane for a time, and then slowly, without needing one. The reunion between her and Cerelia was ordinary in its tenderness. Shared porridge, soft scolding about table manners, the reappearance of Sunday hymns hummed at the sink. Those small things mattered more than any grand public vindication. Life in the mansion changed because the law of the house began to be negotiated, not declared. Xavier learned to ask rather than order. He learned to allow questions to stand unanswered. He learned the humility of domestic compromise, of waiting for a second opinion on a gardener's hire, because Cerelia had an idea about soil, of learning the right way to tie a child's shoelace because it mattered to someone in the household. He watched gradually as his love turned from possession to partnership. Cerelia found new rhythms as well. She returned to the village more often than expected, with the pot of basil still in her window and a small bed of herbs near the back door of the mansion. She developed friendships across the lines that once divided. Jarvis and Alicia came to stay for dinners, and the staff who had once observed her like an exhibit began to mingle with her as people do when time softens edges. There were moments of friction. Old habits die slowly, but those moments were no longer permanent. Xavier apologized when he tried to control. Cerelia forgave when she could, and when she could not. They talked with bluntness that left both parties raw but honest. The rosy veil of the early pages of romance never descended. What they had was a careful architecture of mutual respect. One winter's evening, when the mansion had settled into a domestic quiet, and the city outside had the hushed air of a place that sometimes remembered to sleep, Grandmother came to visit the private dining room. She sat in a chair that had once been her favorite in a kitchen that now served different kinds of meals. She looked at Xavier and then at Cerelia with a clarity that startled them both. "You did right," she said to Cerelia, voice thin but strong. "You chose what was yours to protect, and you, boy, do better than I thought you'd do." Xavier smiled, a real small smile that reached his eyes and made those near lines deepen in a human way. "I have much to learn," he admitted, "but I will learn." Grandmother took both of their hands, her fingers like paper over theirs. "Love doesn't erase the debt," she said, "but it changes the way you carry it. You carry it together now." The epilogue of their public life settled into the private acts that cemented their partnership. They planted a small garden near the mansion's service wing, a defiant patch of green tended by Cerelia and patched by Xavier when his hands were not needed for the ledger. They visited the village, where children who had once watched Cerelia leave for the city now waved and recognized the woman who had returned bearing a name and a dignity. Xavier, who had spent a life amassing things to compensate for absence, learned to collect different treasures. A recipe memorized, the exact way to fold a scarf that Grandma liked, the sound of Cerelia laughing at an offhand joke. He began to write in a journal, first awkward entries that read like minutes, then longer paragraphs that felt like confession. He didn't stop being the city's formidable figure. Power in his world did not vanish overnight. But he used that power more carefully and less as an instrument of ownership. Cerelia did not become someone else. She remained steadfast, stubborn when it served, soft when it mattered. Her choice to stay had not made her dependent. If anything, her position allowed her to shape parts of the mansion's life for the better. She organized a small fund for the hospital's cardiac ward, insisting it be anonymous. She used her influence to get nurses better shift rotations. Small changes such as these felt like the practical manifestation of her values. Their marriage, legal at first by coercion, then made solemn by choice, lived in the ordinary places couples live, in the negotiation of breakfasts and the argument about whether to accept this charity or that, in the nights where one woke and the other was there to make tea, in the mornings when Xavier, in an act that grew from habit to tenderness, would wander into the kitchen to find Cerelia tending basil, and would stand behind her, not to possess, but to support. The city did not change its fundamental appetite for scandal overnight. It still loved its papers and its gossip. But the story of the town girl who had been forced to marry a feared Mafia boss to save her grandmother, and who then chose to stay, settled into people's retelling as a complicated thing, not an easy headline. Some applauded the transformation, some remained skeptical. Cerelia no longer cared for the applause. She cared for quiet competence and the sound of Grandma humming again. One morning, some months after Grandma's last hospital visit, Cerelia stood by the old oak tree outside the village church and watched a small child trip and fall. The child cried. Without thinking, she ran forward and helped the little one up, smoothing dirt from a knee the way she had been smoothed when she was 5. She felt the edges of the moment slide into memory. Across the square, Xavier watched her and, without dramatics, walked to her side. He had stopped making grand gestures. He had learned that the grander moves were not a substitute for small, repeated choices. He took her hand and squeezed, a quiet pledge. They had been thrust into marriage by a cruel bargain. They had been forced into a union that began with a ledger. But it had not remained ledgered. It had become, slowly and painfully and honestly, something that neither of them had expected. An alliance formed out of shared vulnerability and deliberate care. Cerelia had reclaimed her agency. Xavier had learned to ask rather than to demand. The cost had been high: reputations, trust, family splinters. But the ongoing cost was something they accepted: mutual work to be better than their histories. Her grandmother lived on, humming and scolding in equal measure, a presence that stitched their days into common fabric. The White family's influence dimmed. Frank's punishment tempered his arrogance. Zeman, chastened, found a quieter life in the village where the smallness of his ambitions matched reality. At night, when sounds from the city eased into a distant murmur, Cerelia and Xavier would sit by a single lamp and trade stories, the small, ordinary narratives that stitch households into lives. He would tell her about his youth, about the way his mother had used names like currency. She would tell him about the way lavender smelled drying in a back room and the feel of Grandma's hand as she kneaded dough. They would make plans not for empires but for dinners, and the possibility of a child who might one day laugh at the idea that a name could be bought. Their love, when it came, was not a tidy transformation. It was messy and hard-won, An arc from coercion to consent, from purchase to partnership, from fear to the risk of choosing each other every day. The title that would, in headlines, once have read like a scandal, forced to marry a cruel mafia boss to save her grandmother. She never expected his endless love, was accurate in the first part. But the rest of their life refused to be truncated by a sensationalist headline. It became instead a slow story of repair where the real triumph was not in spectacle, but in the quiet acts of care that prove love can transform what was once a wound into something like a home. If you'd like to follow more chapters of lives that change in unexpected ways, subscribe and join the story.